You ever come home with milk bread and a stupid little plan to do absolutely nothing for the rest of the day, then find your neighbor out back stealing your yard in broad daylight? Yeah, that was my Saturday. Nothing wakes you up faster than a shirtless man with a hammer acting like your property line is just a polite suggestion. I pulled into my driveway with groceries in the back seat. The radio still going, sun out. Normal day, boring day. The kind of day you forget as soon as it's over. Then I looked past my kitchen window toward the backyard and saw fresh wood posts standing where they had no business standing. For a second, my brain just locked up. Not because I didn't know what I was seeing, but because I knew exactly what I was seeing, and it was so outrageous my mind wanted to reject it. There was a man hammering boards into a brand new fence. That man was not somebody I hired. It wasn't a city crew, wasn't a landscaper, wasn't some confused contractor at the wrong address. It was my new neighbor, Rick Dawson, shirtless, sunglasses on, pounding nails like he was founding a new nation. And that fence wasn't near the line. It wasn't close enough to be called an accident. It was sitting about 2 feet inside my yard, clear as day, like he'd just decided my grass looked better attached to his house. I stood there with 2 grocery bags cutting into my fingers, staring like an idiot. You know how your mind starts reaching for nicer explanations before it accepts the ugly one? Maybe he's replacing an old panel. Maybe he's fixing storm damage. Maybe I'm looking at the angle wrong. Then Rick looked up, wiped the sweat off his forehead, gave me this little half smile, and went right back to hammering. That was the moment it stopped being confusion. That was intention. I've lived in that house almost 15 years. I bought it when I was younger and had more energy than money, which is a dangerous combination if you own tools. I fixed that place up one project at a time. I rebuilt the shed, planted trees, patched the patio, and one summer I leveled half that backyard myself with a shovel, because apparently I had decided suffering was cheaper than hiring help. That yard became my place to breathe. Trim grass, old red shed, one giant oak tree, older than the whole neighborhood, the kind of tree that makes shade feel like a blessing. On summer evenings, I'd sit out there with a cold drink and listen to the wind move through the branches. No drama, no noise, just peace. For 14 of those 15 years, my neighbors were normal. Good normal. Wave across the driveway, borrow a ladder, bring over leftover barbecue normal. Then Rick moved in about 6 months before all this happened. From day one, Rick had that look about him like every moment of his life had an audience, even when nobody was watching. Big truck, loud exhaust voice, a little too loud for the distance between 2 people. First week he came over, smiling, shook my hand, introduced himself, did the whole friendly neighbor routine. We talked about the block, the houses, the yard, the old oak tree, the line marked by the original survey pins. Seemed harmless enough. Then the comments started. Man, you've got a lot of room back there. Funny how the fence line sits so far over. Never made sense to me why that strip runs that way. Always casual, always tossed out like he was just making conversation. After the 5th or 6th time, I realized he wasn't making conversation. He was measuring. Every time he stood in his yard, his eyes would drift over mine like he was shopping. So when I saw him out there that Saturday morning, I set the groceries down on the patio, walked across the grass, and said as calm as I could, "Hey, Rick, I think there's been a mistake. That fence is on my property." He didn't even stop right away. Just drove one more nail in, stood up slow, and turned toward me like I was the one interrupting his day. Then he laughed. Not the nice kind, not embarrassed, not nervous. That smug little laugh people use when they think they've already won. "No mistake," he said. "Those old markers are wrong. This strip's always been part of my yard." I just blinked at him. Because no, it had not always been part of his yard. When I bought the house, the bank required a full survey. I had the map. I had the deed. I had the county paperwork. The pins were still in the ground. This wasn't fuzzy. This wasn't one of those stories where both sides sort of have a point. This was clean. I told him that. I said, "Rick, I have the original survey. You're 2 feet over." He shrugged like facts were a matter of personal taste. Then he said the line that lit the whole thing on fire. "If you think I'm wrong, take me to court." He said it easy, almost cheerful, like he was inviting me to a barbecue. And right there, I understood exactly what kind of man I was dealing with. A man who bets on fatigue. A man who figures most people won't want the paperwork, the time, the stress, the county office, the waiting, the headache. People like Rick count on one thing more than anything else: your reluctance. He thought I'd look at 2 feet of grass and decide it wasn't worth the trouble. What he didn't know was I am exactly the kind of person who keeps every closing paper, every survey map, every county record in a folder in my office labeled property. Nothing exciting about that, I know. Not a sexy quality. But let me tell you, boring habits get real interesting when somebody tries to move your fence line with a hammer. So the next morning, while Rick was probably drinking coffee and admiring his little expansion project, I was at my kitchen table with a yellow highlighter, my deed, my survey, my plat map, and the phone number of a licensed land surveyor. Because once somebody tells me to take them to court, I start by getting receipts. What Rick did was one of those things that sounds small until you've owned a house. 2 feet. That's what people say, right? Just 2 feet. But if you own land, you know it's never just the dirt. It's the principle, the record, the line, the future problem growing roots if you let it sit there. And in some places, if somebody plants themselves on your property long enough and nobody pushes back, that headache gets a whole lot uglier. I knew enough to know delay was the one gift I could not give him. So I called the surveyor. He showed up the following Thursday morning in a white truck with an orange tripod. And that calm, no-nonsense energy only older men with field boots seemed to have. His name was Calvin Mercer. Sun-beaten face, quiet voice, looked like he'd measured half the state and been unimpressed by most of it. He shook my hand, looked over the paperwork spread across the hood of my car and said, "All right, let's see where the truth lives." I liked him immediately. If you've never watched a real survey happen, it's strangely tense. No shouting, no theatrics, just precision. Calvin moved across the yard, slowly checking coordinates, pulling tape, setting up equipment, comparing records, walking the line twice, maybe 3 times. Meanwhile, Rick was out by his driveway pretending to wash his truck, which would have been more convincing if he hadn't spent most of the time staring at us over the roof. That's the thing about bluffing. It gets very quiet when proof arrives. After about 2 hours, Calvin walked over holding a bright orange marker flag. Then he planted it in the dirt, about 2 feet inside Rick's new fence line. Then another. Then another. A dead straight row of little orange flags cutting right through Rick's shiny new posts like they were there to personally embarrass him. Calvin stepped back, wiped his hands, and said, "Well, there it is. Fence is on your property. About 2 feet. Not maybe, not close, not arguable." Rick came over trying to look casual, but the swagger had leaked out of him by then. He pointed at the flags and said, "What's all this?" Calvin didn't even blink. "Official survey markers. Based on county records, the line runs right here." Rick squinted down the row, then said, "Those records are wrong." Calvin gave this tiny little chuckle, the kind that isn't rude, just tired. County deed, subdivision map, and original survey all match. Lines don't get much clearer than that. You could almost hear Rick's brain hitting a wall. But instead of backing off, he crossed his arms and said, "Well, I'm not tearing it down." That was the moment my anger cooled off. Funny thing, really. Up until then, it had felt personal. Man versus man. Ego, nerve, disrespect. But once the survey was done, it wasn't personal anymore. Now it was administrative. Dry, dull, beautiful paperwork. And paperwork has teeth when it lands on the right desk. So the next Monday, I took Calvin's report, my deed, my property file, and drove to the county land office. If you've ever been in one of those places, you know the mood. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, old chairs, people waiting quietly with folders in their laps like they're holding pieces of their own sanity. Nothing dramatic on the surface. But a lot of lives get redirected in rooms like that. I filed a formal encroachment complaint. They reviewed the documents, scheduled a hearing, and 2 weeks later, Rick Dawson walked into county offices looking like he still thought charm might save him. Boots, grin, sunglasses pushed up on his head, same attitude he had in my backyard. We sat across from each other in a small hearing room. At the front was Commissioner Elaine Porter, who had the expression of a woman who had seen every kind of stupid land argument and no longer found any of them creative. She flipped through the file, read in silence, then looked at Rick. "Mr. Dawson," she said, calm as could be, "you constructed a fence on property that does not belong to you." Rick leaned forward. "That survey is wrong." She slid Calvin's report toward him. "This is a licensed surveyor's report based on county records. Do you have conflicting documentation?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. Because of course he didn't. He had a hammer, a smirk, and a fantasy. That is not documentation. Commissioner Porter folded her hands and said, "You are in violation of county property code due to encroachment. You are required to remove the fence and restore the boundary within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in daily fines." That word hit him harder than the rest. Fines. Per day. You could actually see the math start hurting him. And here's the part that still makes me smile. People like Rick always count the cost of pushing you. They almost never count the cost of being wrong. He'd paid to build that fence. Now he had 30 days to pay to tear it back down. The county wasn't bluffing, and neither was I. Exactly 30 days later, I was on my back porch with a cup of coffee when I heard power tools coming from next door. I looked up, and there it was, a demolition crew. 3 guys with pry bars and drills pulling every board Rick had put up. Panels stacked in a pile, posts yanked out of the ground, concrete bases cracked apart. The whole thing coming undone piece by expensive piece. Rick stood there with his arms crossed, face tight, watching his little empire get disassembled before lunch. No sunglasses, no grin, no speech about old markers being wrong. Just a man learning that arrogance gets a lot quieter when it has to hire labor twice. By the end of the afternoon, the fence was gone. The orange flag still marked the real boundary. The strip of grass was back where it had always been under my oak tree in my yard, exactly as it should be. Rick never apologized. Not once. But he never tried anything like that again either. And honestly, that taught me something I wish more people understood sooner. A lot of folks think peace means avoiding conflict. I used to think that too, or at least part of me did. Keep your head down. Don't escalate. Let little things slide. Stay neighborly. Sounds nice. Sometimes it even works. But there's another truth under that one, and it's uglier. Some people read your silence as permission. Some people see patience and mistake it for weakness. They test a line, then another, and if nobody stops them, their confidence starts writing checks reality can't cash. Rick didn't just build a fence, he built a bet. He bet I'd be too tired, too polite, too busy, too reasonable to make it official. And the bitter little lesson tucked inside all this is that boundaries are only as real as your willingness to defend them. Not with screaming, not with threats, just with clarity, paper proof, and the nerve to follow through. That was the part that hit me later after the tools were gone and the yard was quiet again. The grass hadn't changed, the oak tree hadn't moved, the line had always been the line. The only thing that really changed was that Rick finally understood I wasn't the easy target he thought I was. And sometimes that's all justice looks like, not applause, not some big speech, just a man standing in his own yard while the other guy pays to undo his own bad decision. So now we nod if we happen to be outside at the same time. That's about it. No friendship, no warmth, just distance and a kind of cautious respect that got built the hard way. Frankly, I can live with that. Better than living with somebody who thinks they can steal from you one board at a time. And I still sit under that oak tree in the evenings. Same chair, same shade, same yard. Only now every time I look toward that line, I remember something simple and a little bitter. The law moves slow, ego moves fast, and karma sometimes shows up wearing a tool belt. So let me ask you this. If you came home and found your neighbor building a fence 2 feet inside your yard, would you fight it right away or let it go, just to keep the peace? At what point does avoiding conflict become helping the wrong person win? Tell me where you draw that line. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor, an HOA, or anybody else who mistook your patience for weakness, I want to hear that story too.